Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to today's IOP Alliance community call. Today we're going to be talking a bit about the OKW Open Nowhere Data Awards, talking with two teams from the first round of awards. And just as a reminder for those who are not already familiar with the Open Nowhere OKW data standard, it's for the purpose of improving the discovery of manufacturing facilities, including the equipment and the capabilities within those facilities, within the not only the manufacturing industry, but also within maker communities. And so with us today, we have a team from Latin America, and we will have a team from Uganda joining us. Starting with David Castillo, who will be talking a bit about the mapping that was done with his team over the course of the last several months, using, starting out with Google Maps and taking the OKW data standard to get a better sense of the ecosystem of fabrication spaces in Latin America. And so we're going to go ahead and get started there. And I'm going to ask you to share your screen, please, David.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this introduction, and thanks everyone for the invitation and for the support. We're really glad to present this result that is still running. I mean, the project is not over, but we're glad to present that this has been a very productive months of discovery, because there are many things that we never thought to find over this time, and well, this is what I'm going to show you. Okay, so like probably, well, Sarah was mentioning, my name is David Castillo, and I'm working with one of my colleagues that is also belong to the organization that I represent, that is Gleason Biolab. We are located in Mexico City, although we work with several other academic institutions and non-governmental organizations as well. So we're trying to map out the mapping capabilities across Latin America in order to understand the impact of decentralized additive construction technologies. My colleague is Greg Merritt, and he's located in Victoria in Canada. But despite that, it has been a very interesting team to work with. So our preliminary result, starting our initial location using some available application like Google Maps, and addressing to business directly, and these sometimes chambers of production, like for example the Chamber of Economy in Mexico and the Chambers of Economy in Argentina. We were able to identify like two main categories for these spaces. One are community labs that are dedicated to spaces for training and are oriented to education, and the other ones are divided, or it can be defined as industrial fab labs or industrial digital construction labs that are serving for high-profile industries, like, for example, automotive and aerospace, etc. We have divided our searches in these categories, are essentially over 7 categories, although one of them is like overlapping with the capacities of the other 6. And it is 3D printing, laser cutting, CNC enrouting, and PCB electronics and prototyping, as well as Fab Lab. Our preliminary result is indicating that we're able to identify over 3,495 entities. Just to round it up, it's around 300 and 500 entities across Latin America. The majority of these, or the distribution according to these categories, is located in this graph that we're trying to position how these technologies can be divided. The first is 3D printing, accounting for nearly 50% of the businesses and other labs that we were able to contact. And the other one is laser cutting, and then CNC and Fab Labs, and PCB board prototyping is just 5%, probably less. We understand that our preliminary search could be an overestimation in certain cases and an underestimation in many other cases. So we're trying to fine-tune all these searches, approaching to other organizations that have a more defined databases. But one thing that we encountered is that despite we were giving information from the chambers of manufacturing, for example, here in Mexico, and our searches is that not every point listed is active. Sadly, the pandemic affected many of the businesses listed here, even though they are still having a website running. Many of them are no longer active. Other organizations already have dissolved. So we encountered that, and it's one part of the criteria we selected. The point that we created our own database in order to exclude those points that were no longer active. Essentially, we decided to use two criteria: if they have updated information in their websites, and if they have a physical business running. We could make a phone call and we can make a contact with the people and say, hey, we're still running. Yeah, we check them out those places. Sadly, many of these businesses, like I mentioned, they are temporarily shut down due to the pandemic, or they're no longer running. Our preliminary result, starting with a database that we obtained from a colleague in Brazil, and he's running now one of these fab labs, is a place called Fazedores, which means makers in Portuguese, and about 212 entries, which was the initial number of entries that we work with. Only 80 of them are related to digital manufacture. So this ecosystem is telling us that probably not all the points that we were able to locate are related, like physical spaces having the facilities, or maybe are just people providing services related to them. We were able to validate 41% of them, and for those entries, we got confirmation, and we got confirmation of over the contact information that used their social network. The majority of the people don't have a dedicated website. Sometimes they use Facebook, sometimes they use Instagram, and the penetration of these services varies across Latin America. Like, for example, Facebook is well used probably in Mexico and Central America, but from Central America to few countries in South America, Instagram is king, and Twitter is still not as well used as many other social media. In the case of Brazil, we can say that 3D printing and the fab labs are incorporating like the majority of the point, the largest percentage of those that we observed, and later on comes other services, like for example prototyping, that accounts for 38% more or less of the businesses listed here. So even though that 3D printing is like the most conspicuous places or technology adopted by Latin American fab labs or businesses, there are many others that define themselves as prototyping, or they incorporate several other services beyond just providing the machinery for doing the 3D printing. Also, we have to validate using the local authority databases. Like in the case of Mexico, we use the database coming from INEGI, and it's still working on that. And we have a direct contact with the business and organization for a set of initial interviews in order to know a little bit more of the hurdles and the challenges that this organization have. And we can tell the cautionary tale, like in case, like for example, we encounter that even though several websites are active, many places already are shut down. Like for example, the case of La Nave in Mexico. And even though they have a nice and running website, and even they're still offering their services, the place was shut down at the beginning of the pandemic. So we have to validate with the with the communities themselves. So we contact two organizations. One is an organization, an independent organization of makers. Another one is the Mexican Association for Additive Manufacturing, that have been providing the data in order to contract our findings. We also have an structured survey in order to understand and collect all the information, which incorporates, general information of when these spaces were funded and how they're operating, and the amount of machinery they have, and the status if they're still running. As a conclusion for some of the interviews that we're still running and we want to know how the pandemic had affected them, and how the rest of the environment is difficult or not to establish a fab lab or an additive construction technologies in Latin America. We can say that nearly 90% of the maker spaces and additive construction technologies business use social media for advertising themselves, not paying or not using a designed, dedicated website. In general, they report that even though their movement have been running for over more than 20 years in many cases, they report that there's a lack of awareness by either the authorities and the potential users. It could be because of many of the economic factors that had made an unfavorable environment for them and for the users to adopt these technologies. So also, there's still a lot to work on the side of the users, that they're not aware of what they could use, how they can use these technologies to improve their communities or to improve their daily lives. In general speaking, is extremely expensive, around $150,000 for a space in Mexico to start up. And there are many other labs that are being backed by universities, like either private and public universities that have the leverage to do so. But there are really few examples of those that are still running. We can say that it can be divided in the target, in the market or the community that they target. One is training and industry, another one is education. This is a very important topic, I think, in terms of education, because these spaces have been offering the complementary education that many of the students cannot obtain either in their local universities or the schools. So many of them were offering us a little bit more of the information of how they're operating and what are the limitations. And in general, many of the spaces are working under a membership scheme, but it's a very niche, very small community that they can impact with that modality. There's still a lack of awareness, like I was mentioning, over the potential users, that they don't envision how to use these toolings. And in many other things, in case of the regulatory frameworks in Mexico, these spaces are not considered work areas or proper business. So insurance companies cannot offer a defined, a defined contract, or it's difficult to offer them those services. There is a lack of funding coming from either private or public authorities. And in general, it's not easy to import this material because 90% of them are coming from abroad. That gives us a very unfavorable environment, and that the reason that many of these spaces, they have a limited lifespan of 2 and 3 years maximum, right? So many of them have adopted a different option in terms from making a makerspace turning into a more sustainable business model in order to survive this very unfavorable condition. And many have adopted other type of services that they provide, like, for example, all of these spaces, like mentioning here, like Hack Garage, Paradoxal Lab, Makerspace, located across several cities in Mexico, they have adopted a different business model in order to sustain themselves. And many of them have turned into development studios, like for hardware or for software, or become distributors for electronic components. What are the next steps? Because this is still a running project, and we are in the process of verifying the information and the located point that we presented, the 3,500 point, using this survey, and also double checking with the databases that the fabrication or manufacturing chambers or the economic chambers of several countries had provided to us. So we can tell that despite the very unfavorable environment that sometimes these spaces encounter, there are many successful cases. At least we can encounter like 2 of them in Mexico City. Like, for example, the Fab Lab back up by Anáhuac University that had a very, very large hub. They have even a material library, and they were connected with the industry and many other studios like Materium that they offer large-scale additive manufacturing technologies for the industry and for prototyping. So with this, I would like to thank the rest of the people involved here. My colleague that is not here, unfortunately for other for time reasons, but Gregory Merritt, he's located in Victoria, but he had an extensive experience mapping and doing all these kind of studies for his time in the Navy and also at Georgia Tech. And well, me, that we already know a little bit of me, and that's it. If you have any questions or comments, here I am.
Great, thank you so much, David. So yeah, just opening up to anybody here if they have some questions. Just as a reminder, I'm going to put a link to the OKW specifications in chat for folks who aren't already familiar. I know that that's one of the questions that people you know, frequently have had with these awards is and I guess I'm asking the first question in that sense then is how did you find you know, what was the utility of the OKW standard for you in the context of your work? Like, if you could talk a little bit about that, I'd be very, very keen to know.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, from many of the comments of the people that we interview, either just through our survey or direct interviews, like the cases that I presented very quickly, you know, like some of these fab labs in Mexico and other in Central America. Well, many of them actually are seeking for that. You know, many of these funders are saying, hey, we need to have a further organization and how to document our work. So for them, when I presented them the standard, they're saying, this is what we're looking for. Sometimes they're saying, okay, probably part of the standard requirement according to IOP are not that I would say not needed, but probably are not readily implemented. It cannot be implemented immediately. But others, like for example, what type of machinery they have, what type of services they're offering, how to document the file. Like for example, they have trouble in if you want to go to a different place and you have a format, and you move to a different business or you move to a different space and you take your digital file with you, and there's not like a formalization on how to move that to a different type of machine. So this standard definitely will allow them in order to have a more structured way to implement the information or the digital information they want to replicate elsewhere, right? Because someone would define, well, this are the setting for a particular machine, but maybe if they are translating into a different machine or a different context, they need to adapt, right? And sometimes that takes time, and the standardization will allow them to save the time and work, I think, a little bit more harmoniously. Yeah.
Thank you. Feel free, anybody, if you have a question, you can either raise your hand or just unmute your mic and talk, whatever you're most comfortable with.
Yes, hi. Thanks a lot for that presentation and for all the work that you've been doing on this. I think one of the things that I'm sort of curious about hearing your thoughts on is the different sort of kinds of use cases that you've seen when you've been doing the research for this kind of mapping and for this kind of information. You know, we obviously with the focus sort of on maker spaces, for example, you you know, there's the person who wants to make something and is looking for the space. You know, the actual maker themselves, I guess, is one sort of type of user. But kind of thing we're interested in, obviously, in the IPA is sort of people who maybe don't have the skills to manufacture something themselves, but they want to know where they can go to get the thing made by somebody else. I mean, so, you know, I'm just giving some examples, but I was sort of interested in hearing what your thoughts were and what kinds of different types of users this kind of mapping solution would end up ideally serving, both makers and other people.
Yeah. Well, that's a fantastic question. I didn't have enough time for planning that part, but we have a little bit of that in our surveys and in our interviews. We can say that at least in the cases for the makerspace, and at least previous to the pandemic time, because here we have to redefine our expectation in terms of how many of these spaces are still running or not. But at least from the interview that we got, we can divide the users either by people that are still testing the technology. They're not aware, they were not aware of their existence. And I can say like one particular example. In the case of the Fab Lab for 330 ohms makerspace, I remember they mentioned that the majority of their users are K-12 students and university students. So they can split it in these two main groups. K-12 students were like attending a market for the majority of them are private school that they want to incorporate STEM capabilities to the students, and they pay for the students in order to be incorporated into that Fab Lab. So they receive like some training on how to program, a little bit of robotics, a little bit of how to do or design a PCB board, etc. But they don't implement the technology themselves. They're just receiving the training. The other case is like the student, the university student, like they're seeking for spaces in order to complete the project, their semester project, that the university cannot provide, or they become saturated by renting the spaces, you know, so they provide the spaces that these students are looking, because they're well equipped, they have all the equipment that the university were providing, so they can continue with the project there. And the third group is a very interesting group, is what many of them were calling the newcomers, and the other, they can divide it also in two groups. Early adopters, that they were people that were aware of how to use these technologies, and they're seeking to develop a particular project. Those are the I could say the smallest population of them. And the other ones are the adopters are still trying to figure out how to use these technologies, and they're just paying a membership to spend the time figure out how to use them. In the case of the first one, there are very interesting cases, like one guy that was developing an intelligent jacket, and the other one was using a sensor for pressure, for ocular pressure, that turned into a POC. And they actually started a company, a biomedical company, out of that. So you can say that 75% of the users, and not necessarily the ones that are implementing the technology, because let's say that the majority of these spaces are regarded as an extension of schools, because they're providing courses for training how to use the technology, either for programming, either for electronic, either for using additive manufacturing technology for 3D printing or whatever. And the least of the cases are using prototyping as their main source of income. Like, for example, Paradox Lab, that I just recently contacted them in a more personal interview. They were telling me that they're attending, they work with the industry in a very specific project, and it's like tailored project, designing the technology, the programming, etc., etc. So it's a little bit more dedicated niche that they have. But the majority of these spaces and the users are students, and sadly doesn't have the penetration that they could have, because of course, when it become a paid tuition for accessing those places, you are not ensuring that the other people that have a less favorable condition can access to that technology. So I would say that the majority of the users are K-12 and university students from private organizations, and a little bit coming from public organizations. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's very, very interesting, actually. And I think, I mean, Sarah, this may be sort of more of a question in the sense that, you know, not really a question for you, but just sort of maybe get your feedback on this as well, because from that answer, David, I think it sounds like one direction in which we can really benefit this kind of use case for the mapping is to look at sort of linking or adding training capabilities as well as manufacturing capabilities
Right.
to the mapping services that we're developing. If again, it would be really interesting to see sort of how whether that's a direction that would you know, the wider community would look at. And Sarah, that falls very much within the work that you're doing on people and skills. So that's why I thought, you know, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that too.
Yes, absolutely. And this is something that is, you know, that is not unique to your particular scenario, David. It's something that Ronald, and by the way, just to let folks know, Ronald unfortunately is experiencing some major connectivity issues today. So we're going to circle back with him later. But he was you know, leading the team that was the other awardee for round 1 and using OKW. And very similar to this, you know, it comes in the form of discussion around training materials or education or outreach. It's all kind of bundled together because, you know, you have your specifications in order to architect, you know, this ecosystem and inform people of like, these are all of the, you know, facilities and machines and et cetera that are available, but then what do you do with them?
Right.
And how do you get connected with the people who understand what to do with them? And as a part of, you know, my my particular role in looking at people and skills and recommendations for how do you know, dovetail that knowledge base in with this, you know, either geolocation or mapping of facilities, you first have to get a sense of like, what is it that people need to know? What is it that people need to be trained on? What is the baseline or the minimum for this particular facility or this particular facility, whether you're dealing with textiles, woodworking, what type of machinery, you know, like all of that. And so, and this is, I mean, it's, you know, it's questions that lead to more questions, but it's encouraging in the sense that this is a pattern. And, you know, when we talk about what to add to the current standard or in continuing discussions, like this is a gap. This is a need that's coming up for most everyone who is engaged with this particular standard before.
Yeah, I could like to add that I forgot to mention that regarding that, how it's been implemented, how this technology has been implemented, and who is implementing it and who is adopting it. I think it's a great interest, at least in the Mexican environment, or at least in other places, like for example in Argentina, that we were able to see the same pattern. There's a great interest from either people seeking training into learning electronics and programming. So they're using they're using 3D printing not as the main interest, but to complement their project for their electronic project, for example. So for example, one of the person that we interviewed, Norman, he was telling me that, yeah, students arrive there and saying, hey, I would like to do this robot, but I would like to learn first how to program it, how to create the PCB, and probably if I have enough funding or enough time, I will do the 3D printed case or the 3D printing part that are required for that. So it's like I wouldn't say like the end point, like accessing to additive manufacturing, but is the complementary part of a long-term project in learning how to adopt and incorporate those technologies in a more elaborate projects, in a more elaborate product. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's really when you get into the, more of those interdisciplinary or like cross-professional groups. I mean, I'm trying to think of, frame this in academic and community terms because it's not just, yeah. So, does anybody else have any questions that they would like to pose to David?
So I have, yeah, I mean, I have lots of questions, but I want to give the space to other people as well. But I think this, David, might not be specifically related to the research that you did, but one of the things that we're very interested in is sort of repairability and it goes under different names. So there's sort of the right to repair movement and that kind of stuff. And I think it's been very encouraging to see the legislation that was recently introduced in France, where they are mandating that manufacturers of laptops and smartphones, for example, have to sort of publish the repairability index, basically. Sort of, it's a new labeling scheme for certain things. And I'm just sort of curious about the work that you're doing, like how it is, in the context of the people that you're working with, and especially in the context of sort of the kinds of things that we're hoping these kinds of maker spaces and facilities can start to get used for as this sort of repairability and circular economy becomes more mainstream. Is that something that you're seeing some kind of, incentives that are developing within the people that you're working, the communities you're working with, or an interest in that particular type of use case as well?
Right. Okay. I can give you two examples regarding of how these communities have pushed the agenda in order to facilitate the creation of these spaces. One's coming from either public universities, like, for example, the UNAM. They had one of the largest fab labs as well at Anahuac, at least in the Mexican case. And in the other one is the Chilean case in the Católica University. They have one lab that is called the Innovation Lab. And those two labs, they have the advantage of being a public institution that can afford to run long-term projects. But one thing that is very interesting to see is that they have provided enough evidence of the impactful activities they have for the development of the industry. And I have received a lot of support from one of the researchers here at UNAM. His name is Alejandro Pisanti, and he's also part of the Internet Hall of Fame, and he's well connected with some of the spaces that I presented today. And yes, definitely there is a lot of work in the governance and in trying to convince or trying to do a little bit more work in the local governments on how these technologies in the future could help the development of particular key industries, like, for example, in our case, the automotive industry or the aerospace industry. I know that that's another example, for example, in Paraguay, that there was a project between the US government and the local government. Then they recently opened a new space in Paraguay. And it was partially funded by the Paraguayan government and from the US embassy there. And it's for free. A different type of mentality that they decided to spread and make it more accessible in comparison to other fab labs that work here. Like, for example, you go to the NAWAC, you need to be a student or you have to pay a membership or something like that. In order to make it a little bit more accessible, they decided to make it free. So everyone, if had a project, they can access and use the facilities and also have access to the training. So which is, like Sarah was mentioning, one of the key points in here, like how do you use that machinery without any training? You need to adopt something or create some program. So either from the Paraguayan example and from the Católica, they're running all the time like free workshops in order to engage people, like probably not like a very ambitious initial project, like for example, I don't know, making a satellite out of 3D printing, right? But probably a small project that allows people to understand what this technology is for and how can that be impactful in certain areas. Here in Mexico, there's another organization that is trying to push a new law in order to incorporate that into STEM, into the STEM education, like either programming or at least having some notion that the student could have some notions of digital manufacturing is something that they're pushing. One reason is because they want their businesses to thrive again. And the second is because there's a great need in order to the local industries to grow. I was reading a recent note in the news that by the beginning of the administration, which started around 2008, 2019, there were around 5 to 6 million jobs related technology job not filled up because there is a lack of personnel, and definitely this personnel that they're requiring, that the industry is requiring, are need to be related to or have acquired technological capabilities. So it's a great opportunity also that these spaces are pushing in order to make our governments aware that this is not just a fashionable movement. No, it's a very interesting and important knowledge to incorporate in our daily lives. So definitely, I think these spaces are key in order to incorporate these technological adoptions in our countries. Yeah.
Great, thank you. That's very, very, yeah, it's great to see all of these different initiatives. And I think all of these different training courses and skills development initiatives, I think definitely, Sarah, it sounds like your travel itinerary has just been increased to go and speak to all of these different people and initiatives.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, thanks for that, David. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no shortage of conversations to be had here. And it is a very interesting direction. And I do like the tie in, between, policy, local governance, as well as that training, because it really is for the support and invigoration of the community within that, in a particular sector. And so I think it's really important to have those tie-ins with, these co-sponsored and co-funded organizations. And I know that one of the, the outcomes of your research thus far, David, which isn't, specifically related to the standard, but more so around, community development and sustaining this programming, is that trend that you found is that more of these types of spaces are privatizing just for the sheer fact of necessity for survival in order to maintain, funding lines and whatnot. And that then becomes very problematic, because the other trend that you found is that less of these educational opportunities are provided by the privatized companies. And so I think this is a critical conversation that needs to be continued. Does anybody else have any other questions they'd like to pose to David? Because I, of course, have many more. I just want to give, give opportunity. Well, I mean, many more, but also with the recognition that, we've had you for, getting up on a full hour here. And, in thinking about, what the research that you've conducted so far and what comes next, could you talk a little bit about, next immediate steps for
Oh,
continuing this
yes.
work, and some of what we've talked a little bit about conversations that we could potentially be moving forward related to the OKW specification, and conversations around that, and in investigating training and education and whatnot as a component, and how that might work. But where else do you see immediate next steps in your research dovetailing with ongoing conversations related to the standard itself?
Right. Oh, that's a great question. Our first goal is to finish completing the database that we have been collecting. That's our priority, the number one priority. Secondly is validating it, because like I mentioned before, after there definitely, everybody knows, I mean, it's something that we've been in the same boat, everybody. There's a pre-pandemic and post-pandemic economy, right? But that's something that comes from an interview of one of the people that I had a chance to go through. And he was saying, hey, in other ways, despite the pandemic and despite everything that we have been through, as starting this movement that is difficult in countries like Latin America, that have little or doesn't have the same speed of technological adoption, they are creating a new economy, right? Because they're creating jobs, they're creating services that a decade ago didn't exist. Right. So for us, I think that's also a very interesting variable to measure. Once we validate the entries and once we validate the technical capabilities, like one of the standards are also requesting, we would like, and it's just something that is coming a little bit from Greg's, that unfortunately is not here, in order to have a more detailed or more sensitive way to measure the impact of these spaces. Why not to measure using a heat map, right? About the activity that they perform over time and how is overlapping with other movement, like for example, other places are interested or other movement that are interested in adopting those technologies for creating their own tooling or their own their own machinery. Like for example, in the case of that is not directly related, but somehow yes. Like for example, other DIY biolabs, for example, right? That sometimes biomedical equipment is extremely expensive to obtain. Like in one of our cases that I was mentioning, that there is one person that developed one ocular pressure device. Well, there are many more people interested in developing that kind of machinery or devices. Like for example, one of my colleagues from Chile, he developed a small device, portable device, using consumer electronics and 3D printing for measuring malaria in different remote areas in the Amazonic Peru and Brazil. So there's an interest of these communities, but they need to acquire the technological capabilities. So in order to do that, we would like to move forward in measuring that heat map that could allow us to know what is the impact of these spaces. It's like they have the technical capability, they're providing the training, but who is adopting it? Who is adopting it and how? What are the projects they're working with? And if it's either agro industry using drones, and or is it medical devices, or is it telecommunication devices, because sometimes it's very expensive. So it's trying to now look outward, right? It's not just what is happening inside this Fab Lab, but how that technology or those projects being developed there have an impact outside them. So I think that's a great question to address in the future.
No, that's really interesting, and thinking about how to further contextualize that, because you're looking at developing an ecosystem which doesn't exist in a vacuum. You have to have it contextualized with what other commerce and activity is happening there in a specific region. And so I think that that's a really interesting next step. So if there are no other questions, want to give one more chance. And again, thank you, David, so much for all of your work and your contributions to the ongoing discussion around the Open Nowhere standard. One of the things that I do want to remind folks of is that there is still a call for round 2 that is open. I'm going to put the link to that right in chat and also share on my screen so folks can see. There you go. And so I encourage everybody to take a look. If you navigate to that link, it explains a little bit more about the Open Nowhere Data Awards in general, which are very, generously, funded and sponsored by the Sloan Foundation. Round 2 is still open. So if you yourself are interested in submitting an application, or you know of somebody who would be interested in having a look and conducting some testing with the OKW standards, please by all means take a look at the award description and consider submitting an application or forwarding to your colleagues. So thank you again so much. And that's it.